Welcome back. This is lecture one of week three, and I'm here with my new glasses and all. I hope that won't be a distraction for you. Um, and the title of today's lecture is the Augustinian Renaissance. Now, this is an area that is my own area of research and expertise. Um, and I know last lecture I promised that I would try to keep the lectures this week somewhat shorter to make up for the time that I imposed upon you in last week's lectures. And I'll still try to do that, but just as a little warning, this would be difficult for me because this is my expertise. Um, Now, it's important not because of that. It's important because of the background to understanding what was going on theologically with Luther, and therefore in the quote unquote Reformation when we get to the 16th century. And how does this play a part in what I've referred to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages? Now, the reading for this week is Jordan Quedlinburg's Exposition of the Lord's Prayer. I'll be talking a lot more about that in the second lecture for this week, in week three, lecture two. Um, and I'll be going through that text and placing it in the context. But this lecture on the Augustinian Renaissance is kind of the background and the larger context of Jordan's treatise. And you will see why when we get there, I think. Um, and so that's why this is also important for your text analysis. And it's important too because somehow, historiographically, meaning what scholars have written about Luther, the question of Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, Bishop of Hippo, who dies in 430 CE, has played a central part. Was Luther reading Augustine? It's like, yes, but was Luther's theology derived from his own reading of Augustine, or was it derived from the influence of his order? Because Luther was a member of the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, and I talked a little bit about them in the previous lecture. I'll be talking more about them in this lecture. So how does that all relate? It becomes a very complex debate, also in terms of confessional positions, and I'll be going through some of those briefly in a moment. But that's why we're doing this here, because it's terms and terminology that you will come across. Um, your Lindbergh mentions and talks about, not quite correctly, but that's why I'm doing this lecture. And we'll go from there in terms of trying to come to an understanding again of what was new with Luther, because so much that has been seen as new with Luther was not new at all. That's kind of part of this. But there still were new things with Luther. So, okay, what is the whole deal with the Augustinian Renaissance, or another term that's usually used is a late medieval Augustinian ism. And I'll have addressed explicitly right away the whole problem with isms shortly. So this is one of those isms, this problem. How did it develop? Because certainly it was not an issue in the 16th century as such, in that people weren't arguing about what was Augustinianism. They were, though, arguing over Augustine and what was the proper interpretation of Augustine. And then the next question comes is, was Luther a faithful interpreter of Augustine, and what role or impact did the writings of Augustine have on Luther's own Reformation, developing Reformation theology, whatever that might have been, or what had been considered his Reformation theology, because Luther appeals to Augustine himself. As we will see when we get there, the first thesis of his 97 Theses against scholastic theology, um, September 1517, the month before he posted his 95 Theses, he starts out by saying that to say that Augustine exaggerated in anything is a heresy, is itself a damnable heresy. And he's appealing to Augustine time and time again. We'll talk a bit more about that when we get there. Also, this lecture kind of ends, I believe, on the PowerPoint with a question: was Luther an Augustinian? He certainly was as a member of the order, but how did Luther fit into what most of this lecture is going to be about? But that is a topic I'll be talking about, I believe, in week 6 in the lecture. Brother Martin Luther Augustinian. It's chapter 5 or 6 of my book that's assigned for that week. So you don't have to worry about that quite for a while, but that's kind of where this is leading to. So this is not something that once you get through with your first text analysis, you can just forget it and throw it out the door and not worry about it anymore. Because it is a major question issue for the time and for the Christian tradition as such. It becomes, and it still is an issue, even if not under the terms of the labels that I'll be using today in terms of Augustinianism and Pelagianism. It's still a major issue for Christianity today, and the origins of the debate, what it was all about, what difference it all makes, by and large, have been forgotten. And so that too is for me when I'm talking about this, there's that vision towards this is a debate, an issue that should still be a contemporary fervor and interest to debate these topics, because it gets at what is salvation, what is free will, what is grace, and how do those all work. Now, I'm going to just go briefly then through the historiographical tradition on the concept of the Augustinian, not the Augustinian Renaissance, but the late medieval Augustinianism. Because the term Augustinian Renaissance, as I'll mention in a minute, was actually coined in 1977 by my doctoral advisor, Heiko Obermann. But the ideas were then still being argued since the late 19th century in terms of what impact did Augustinianism have on Luther and his developing theology. Anyway, and it becomes very complex too, because as we turn into the historiographical traditions, you'll have Protestant scholars and Catholic scholars arguing the same thing, but for different reasons. So if you look at that second slide, I have their position 1 is Luther received nothing from the late medieval theological tradition, but was his own unique theologian. Now, the Protestant view of that was that Luther was distinct from anything medieval. I mean, Luther is almost seen by Protestants, by some Protestant factions, as a divinely inspired individual that has no relationship to this corrupt medieval Catholic tradition. Yet the Catholic view will also argue that Luther had nothing to do from the late medieval theological tradition because Luther was a heretic. He didn't receive any influence from what was good Catholic theology. So you have both Protestants and Catholics arguing the same point, but from different perspectives and with different purposes and reasons. The second position, of course, then, was that Luther was a product of the late medieval theological tradition. The Protestant argument for that is that Luther, basically, this is the not a heretic arguments, that Luther was unique, but was in keeping with the medieval theological tradition, and the problem was that the church had deviated therefrom. So it wasn't Luther. Luther, it's Jesus, Paul, Augustine. They'll point to Bernard of Clairvaux, and Luther even pointed out Gregory of Rimini, the name I'll come back to, an 14th century Augustinian hermit and theologian. And then Luther, they are the proper and the good theological tradition. All coming from Paul, because for Luther, Augustine, what made Augustine so important, he was the best interpreter of Paul. So it was the Catholic Church, it was the later medieval Catholic hierarchy and tradition that deviated from what was good Christian theology that Luther was simply then coming back to, and he had always been a part of, and the church has almost like continuous line, and then the church deviates. I can't do that very well. The church deviates, and Luther goes on. That's the Protestant view of the second position. The Catholic view was that Luther was a product of the late medieval theological tradition. Yeah, he was, but that theological tradition was corrupt. Kind of just almost turning Luther's, or the Protestant view of this on his head, saying, yes, indeed, the church had deviated from good Catholic theology, and it's out of that deviant theological tradition that Luther emerged. And that position is more about also a philosophical view. William of Ockham, whom I'll talk about briefly, I think I mentioned he was a supporter of Louis of Bavaria, was seen as the big heretic there. Not only did he argue against the Pope and calling the Pope Antichrist and everything else, because he did that too after the Sachsenhausen appeal, um, but also he was, quote unquote, a nominalist. And I'll briefly talk about that term nominalism shortly. It's a very misunderstood tradition. But that's a whole other issue in some ways. But as such, he destroyed what was called the Thomistic synthesis of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas in the later 13th century was seen as the epitome of Catholic theology, fusing the philosophical tradition coming from the Greeks with the Christian tradition and faith and reason and harmonizing. And Thomas basically was seen as figuring it all out and being the standard for theology. And any falling away from that or disagreement with that was a decrepit or deviant theology. That was a very prevalent view within Catholic scholarship for quite a while. And it's all was seen as having begun with Occam. And Luther knew Occam, or at least knew some of Occam, and Luther referred to Occam as my teacher. So for the Catholic tradition, the second position is like, this is clear that Luther was a heretic from the get-go because, as happenstance would have it, or circumstances would have it, he kind of grew up, so to speak, within this heretical, virtually heretical, certainly deviant tradition of late medieval theology. Now, those are the two basic positions. So we have Protestants and Catholics arguing the same thing, but for very different reasons, coming from very different perspectives with very different outcomes or hopes of those outcomes. But now let's look at what follows, because we have the problem of, first of all, as people are arguing back and forth, what is Augustinianism? Now, here, the problem is with isms, as I have up there, as I've already mentioned. But Augustinianism, I've argued actually in most of my works, a lot of my works, that we shouldn't use the term Augustinianism because as an ism, it was a creation of the 19th century by German scholars in making this metaphysical thing out of an adjective. Because Augustinianism is derived from that which is Augustinian, which is an adjective of a theological position, an ethical position, a philosophical position, a religious position. It's describing a given thought or position as being derived from or influenced by Augustine. So there's no strict, concrete definition of what is Augustinian, except that it has to relate to Augustine of Hippo in his works. And therefore, there's no concrete definition of Augustinianism as the noun derived from the adjective. And yet, what Heiko Oberman saw in 1977, in an article published, and he put it as part of a major book of his, was that there was an Augustinian Renaissance, a rebirth of Augustine in the 14th century, just as we talk about the Italian Renaissance, the rebirth of classicism, the rebirth of classical culture, at least perceived. And here, Oberman is saying what was going on too was with the Augustinian tradition. Now, in some ways, he was drawing from the works of an Augustinian hermit himself, Damasus Trapp, who had already argued that there was this close association between the Augustinian hermits and early humanism, the early humanist movement. And so I think Oberman seized on that because he knew Trapp. I got to know Trapp. That's another story. And they worked together on editing, actually, the Sentences Commentary of Gregory of Rimini, which I'll get to Gregory of Rimini shortly. So they certainly knew each other. And before Oberman wrote his article, but he then takes that insight of Trapp and turns it into this whole big development of this rebirth of Augustine. Because Trapp had also talked about seeing a new, what Trapp referred to as the new Augustinian school. The new Augustinian school, which by what he meant there was within the Augustinian order in the 14th century, he saw um, a notable increase in the scholarly erudition with respect to the works of Augustine by members of the Augustinian order. And he noted that, unlike Occam, even though there were some people, some Augustinians who were following Occam, who were quote unquote nominalists, the Augustinians also held to a very strong Augustinian position on the issue of predestination and the relationship between grace and free will. Obermann turned that into this thesis of the Augustinian Renaissance, whereby this campaign against the modern Pelagians, the Pelagiani Moderni, the new Pelagians, led to a return to looking to Augustine's work. So this academic scholarly erudition with respect to Augustine's works, and there are a lot of them, came out of this new campaign against the modern Pelagians. Now, problems with isms, I think I've already mentioned them, nominalism and Augustinianism. They're not set. I'm not going to go into that any further, or that would be taking us away from the whole point of all of this. But here I want to stress, though, is that this thesis of Obermann, it gets complex because it then culminated in what was known as the Via Gregorii at the University of Wittenberg, which Luther was teaching according to, and the Via, or the Way of Gregory. And Obermann saw that as being Gregory of Rimini, this 14th century Augustinian hermit, who too talked about the modern Pelagians, even though the first scholar to talk about the modern Pelagians was a British scholar by the name of Thomas Bradwardine, who wrote a book, The Case of God Against the Modern Pelagians. That's where the term comes from. It was not an Augustinian. Thomas Bradwardine is a very interesting figure. Actually, he was not a nominalist, if that means anything to anybody. He was more of a realist. But he wrote this great work, and Gregory of Rimini may or may not have known it, but shortly after Bradwardine's De Causa Dei contra Pelagianos Modernos, in his Sentences commentary, which was the basic major theological work, a commentary on Peter Lombard's Sentences, too advocated a very strong Augustinian position on predestination and the relationship between grace and free will. So Obermann sees this as a kind of this line going from this rebirth of Augustinian anti-Pelagianism through Gregory of Rimini, then into the University of Wittenberg, and into Luther, as explaining, or at least providing the context of the development of Luther's early Reformation theology. Now, that is a position that I have attacked, and in my mind have completely dismantled and destroyed, and have provided a new beginning for understanding what was going on and how it all worked together. Because on the one hand, yes, there is a notable attempt to counter a perceived new Pelagianism in Thomas and Gregory. We see a little hint of it in Hugolanus of Orvieto, another Augustinian hermit, and then with Luther. That was it. The other Augustinian hermits, even ones who had adopted and advocated for a very strong Augustinian position on predestination and the relationship between grace and free will, did not put it in context of combating this new Pelagianism, or this not fighting against the Pelagiani Moderni. So it becomes more complicated. Number one. Number two, the rebirth of Augustine scholarship, of going back to the sources of Augustine, and the erudition of knowing Augustine's works backwards and forwards and better than anybody else had, preceded the new campaign against the modern Pelagians. So it came first. It didn't come out of. And what led to that is what then I will argue, and have argued, is the true, quote unquote, the true historical Augustinian Renaissance, a rebirth of Augustine embodied within the members of the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. But we'll get there when we get there. First, I need to say something about this distinction between Augustinianism, or position of Augustine, and Pelagius. And what is Pelagianism? Where does it come from? Why is it a big issue? And all those things. So Pelagianism. I'll try to keep this short. Pelagianism comes from Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was a British monk. He was a younger contemporary of Augustine. If you don't know who Augustine was, I'm sorry. Augustine was one of the major church fathers, perhaps the most important, one of the most influential church father or theologian or thinker or author after Paul is Augustine. And most people would accept that when you start looking at things. In some of the Reformation, Luther appeals to Augustine, Calvin appeals to Augustine. It's a major issue. Anyway. But Pelagius was a very fervent Christian, very devout Christian, and he had read some of Augustine's early works on the happy life and the blessed life, De Beata Vita, and on the freedom of the will. I thought they were great. He made a pilgrimage to Rome. By this time, Augustine was back in Hippo. By this time, in North Africa, and Pelagius was shocked by what he saw in Rome. Now, we'll see when we get to Luther. Luther went to Rome too, and was also shocked by what he saw, but kind of differently than Pelagius. But we'll get there when we get there. But in some ways, similarly too. Because what Pelagius saw was that these people were calling themselves Christians, but certainly were not acting as like Christians. And it was while he was in Rome that then he got a hold of a copy of Augustine's Confessions. And that disturbed him greatly, because this was an author that he had come to respect and like. And here in Book 10 of the Confessions, Augustine repeats a statement, I think, 7 or 8 times. And that statement is, grant what you command, and command what you will. Now think about that. What Augustine is saying is, God, give us the ability to do whatever you command us to do. And if you give that to us, then go ahead and command us to do anything at all, because we can do it through you. This is also Paul's line, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, referring to Christ. But Pelagius saw it as this completely undermines responsibility. It undermines the role that Christians need to play in life. Because for Pelagius, the problem with Christianity, as he saw it, especially in Rome now, was that people were weak. People were weak. They weren't really Christians. What did Christ command us? Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, for Pelagius, it's like God would not give us a command that we could not fulfill. Because otherwise, it's like, what's the point? What's the point of commanding somebody when they can't do it? Or, if you take Augustine's route, giving them the ability to do it and then command it takes away all kinds of merit and responsibility. It undermines ethics and everything else. And Pelagius was a moralist. Augustine was not. He was all for morality, certainly. But that was not the point for him. Morality didn't really have anything to do with salvation for Augustine. For Pelagius, it had everything to do with it. Now, Augustine would say, well, yes, we should live moral Christian lives. The scriptures reveal how we should live. I preached all the time. There's over 500 sermons of Augustine's. Excellent. I preach all over town to my parishioners how you should live a moral, ethical Christian life. The point is, that has nothing to do with salvation. Why? Here's an example. The thief on the cross. Those of you who know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But those of you who don't, when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified next to two thieves who were condemned for death for thieves. And one of them is ridiculing him, making fun of him. Jesus, that is. When the other thief tells his companion thief to kind of shut up, man, he says, we deserve to be here. This man is innocent. And he says, Lord, please remember me when you come into your glory. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you, you will be with me today in paradise. The thief on the cross was the first person Jesus saved. Depending on what we mean by that, but in terms of saved into to welcoming into heaven, was a thief on the cross who lived an immoral life all the way through. And this will come back, or theologically could be an issue, because Jesus also says, when he's asked what do you need to do to be saved, he says, be baptized and follow me. The thief on the cross was not baptized. So that's an issue there too. But I'm just talking about interpreting some of these positions as statements. Morality has nothing to do with it. St. Paul in Romans says, wretched man that I am, who's going to save me from this body of death, because I don't do what I know I should do. I don't even do what I want to do. I do what I don't want to do, which is the evil, because I like it. It's not about morality for Augustine. For Pelagius, it is. And if you do not live as God commands, it's because you're weak. It's because you don't have what it takes. This gets at the issue of sin. For Augustine and for Pelagius, they agreed that Adam and Eve, originally in paradise, Adam and Eve had the option. They could sin or they could not sin. And what was sin? Well, God had given them a very simple command. You can eat of any fruit of any tree in this garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Just one tree. Plenty of others. And then that serpent comes along and deceives Eve. All kinds of discussions about this and interpretations of it. And Eve disobeyed God and ate the apple and then gave it to Adam. And what an idiot says, okay, sure, yeah. He's like, honey, here, eat this. Okay, great. Anyway, we'll go into those, but you got to think what a bunch of idiots. Anyway, because of that, they fell. Were cast out of paradise. That sucked. But that was sin. That was the original sin. The fall from paradise. After that point, Augustine argued, human beings, because we're all born in sin. And from that original sin, we're all born into a state of sin, because for Augustine, sin is first and foremost a state. It is not being in paradise. It's not being in harmony and union with God. We don't go walking with God through the garden anymore. Adam and Eve did until they ate the apple and they hear God say, hey, Adam, where are you? Oops, I'm naked, I'm hiding. Oh, you are sinful. You are cast out. The garden is closed. In a state of sin, human beings cannot not sin. Then in heaven, we will be in a state where we cannot sin. So we go from pre-fall, prelapsarian as it's called, being in a state of being able to sin or not to sin, to a state of being not able not to sin, to a state of being not able to sin. For Pelagius, there is the fall. And with the fall comes the fall of all of nature. There weren't thorns on rose bushes until the fall. There weren't mosquitoes until the fall. All those nasty things that make life miserable in the natural world are a result of the fall, supposedly. So, and our will is hindered for Pelagius. But every human being, even after the fall, still has the choice to sin or not to sin. We have the same choice as Adam and Eve, and all we have to do is choose not to, and we won't. That was Pelagius' view. Now, he was very much opposed to Augustine's view, grant what you command and command what you will, because that means we have no responsibility. You've just undermined all of ethics. You wiped out, the merit of doing what we're told, the achievement. My gosh, Paul too, uses athletic analogies. I have, run the good race. I've finished my task. That's what we are doing in this life. We're almost in an athletic competition to get to the goal, which is in heaven. And how do we do that? By doing what God has commanded us to do, by not sinning. And we can do that. Otherwise, what's the point? Because it's all predetermined anyway. Now, it's an issue of moral responsibility and salvation. And this gets at the issue of predestination, grace, and free will. And what is the relationship between all of those? Because Pelagius did not deny grace. For Pelagius, everything that is based on grace, is based on God's creation, is based on God giving us the abilities to follow his will. That is grace. Within that, though, we use our free will to merit, and salvation is based on how well we use our free will. For Augustine, God from all eternity has predestined those souls for salvation. The Fall of the Angels comes first for Augustine, and in his City of God, written between 413 and 426, his magisterial work, in my view, his greatest work. He relates the fall of the angels and the creation of the angels with the separation of the light from the darkness on the first day of creation. Now, that's not the point in terms of was he right about that. The point is, in an atemporal world for God, creation and the final judgment are simultaneous. It's an eternal present. Temporality is the problem. It's almost a fall into temporality. There's a before and an after, and on we go. And there, after the fall, everybody, every individual deserves punishment and damnation in hell. Because we are all inheritors of the sin of Adam and Eve. We're born in a state of sin. And what's the wages of sin? Death. For Augustine, the state of sin is most important. Now, we can also do individual sins as well. But in that state of sin, for Pelagius, there's no such thing as a state of sin. The playing field is no longer level. It's kind of skewed, not in our favor. But sin is what people do. Yeah, it is what people do, but it's far more than that. It is the state that we are in the fallen world that we are in. Now, the debate went on. Pelagius even went to see Augustine in Hippo, but Augustine was in Carthage, was away. They never really met. Pelagius also had a follower, Julian of Eclanum, who started really adhering to his teacher Pelagius's positions, and started writing fiercely against Augustine, and there soon broke out what became known as the Pelagian controversy between Pelagius first and Augustine, and then this Julian of Eclanum and a couple of others that Augustine has to write against, to refute, because he saw it as so dangerous. Because if God's will can be thwarted, is God omnipotent? If what we choose to do as human beings can affect God's will, is God really God? Or does God not care? Does God say, okay, all of you have free will, fine, go. Do what you want, I don't care. Or does God care about each person? And in that context, in his mercy, has reached down and saved the elect, those who are dear to him. Now, in this world, Augustine argues, we have no idea who's who. And you can't relate it to who's moral. You can't relate this the city of God, which is people who are in or will be in heaven, and the angels. You can't equate that with who's in the church. That gets to be a whole other problem issue, because it's the misunderstanding of Augustine that became so detrimental for the history of medieval Christianity, and in many ways, I'd argue for Christianity ever since. Salvation is not something that we earn. No one is righteous, no, not one. It is a gift of God's grace. Now, I'm not going to go into all those issues. We'll meet some of them again when we get to Luther and the whole issue with indulgences and Luther's early theology and the theses against scholastic theology and the 95 Theses. This will come back. I wanted just to set that stage because it's the same debate that breaks out in the 14th century. The New Pelagians, as their opponents are labeling them, are the ones that, to the people who are attacking the New Pelagians, are those they seem to be letting merit and free will back in. No, Pelagianism, as I said, was put it up there in the last slide, was condemned in 418 under Augustine's influence and authority and power, getting condemned. No one thereafter, no Christian theologian thereafter would have said, yes, I'm a Pelagian. Because that's the same as saying, I'm a heretic. Oops, there's a problem. But you have a problem. What do? How do you preach predestination? How do you try to win converts if you're preaching predestination? Now, again, the point here is not predestination and not the theological topics as such, but to understand what was going on. And pretty soon scholars started to devise a number of very ingenious ways and concepts to get around this issue. It's not one or the other. It's kind of both. And yes, it all comes from God's grace, but then it's what we do with our free will. After having been given grace, we can merit our salvation by how well. It's like the parable of the talents. We all start out with something, that's the grace, and then what do we do with it? Now, we'll come back to those issues later. But in the 14th century, there's this perceived creeping in of Pelagianism, which is basically, I want to earn it. I want to deserve it. I've been good. I've tried so hard. I deserve to be saved. I deserve heaven. I deserve salvation because I, damn it, have done my best. I'm worthy of it. And Augustine would come back and say, you fool. You're just thinking of yourself, and that is the very definition of sin. The very definition of sin, aside from the state of sin, is being turned in on yourself, not turned towards God. And if you're concerned about your salvation, you're thinking about me. Oh my, am I going to be saved or not? Augustine's like, salvation is none of your business. What is our business is doing God's will, as it's been revealed to us, and going from there. So there began to be these inklings of, this new, primarily Franciscan theology was problematic. Little wonder that there's a debate between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, because they had been debating in conflict all along. Very complex story. You'll read some of about that in my Luther book in various chapters. But I want to really go back and look at this turn to Augustine in the scholarly sense in the later Middle Ages. And here I have the True Sons of Augustine. In my argument that the scholarly erudition returning to the sources of Augustine preceded this campaign against the modern Pelagians, or preceded a renewed, strongly Augustinian position on grace and free will and predestination, an anti-Pelagian position, because we can talk about Augustine's anti-Pelagian writings. Often his later writings, And they really become to the fore in terms of the texts of Augustine that become upheld and used by the Augustinian hermits and by Luther. But we'll talk about all that when we get there with Luther. So what was going on? And here we then have to kind of go back to where I left off at the last lecture with the conflict between John the 22nd and Louis of Bavaria. Augustus of Ancona's support for John the 22nd, William of Cremona's support for John the 22nd, and the granting by John the 22nd in 1327 to the Augustinian hermits of custody of Augustine's tomb in Pavia. Now, there was a problem there because Augustine's tomb and his bones, which had been taken from Hippo when he died, first to Sardinia and then to Pavia. In the 8th century, Emperor Lukebrand brought them to Pavia because Islam was taking over northern Africa. So they first went to Sardinia, and his relics, his bones, were brought then further to Pavia, which was an imperial residence at the time, and were housed in the Church of St. Peter's in Pavia. The Augustinian canons were already had custody of St. Peter's in Pavia. They had been granted or installed there because the Benedictines, who had been there previously, were not doing a very good job in terms of pastoral care and all those other things. So the Pope put in the canons, and the canons were responsible for Augustine's tomb. These are Augustinian canons, after all, and they too trace their heritage back to Augustine, supposedly. So when the Pope says, okay, you have to share it with the hermits, the canons are like, no way in hell. Are you kidding me? Why would we do that? This is a competing religious group. We're not going to share anything with them. We're not even going to let them in. And this was in 1327. The delegation from the hermits said, yeah, but the Pope says so. Oh, really? Can you produce the papal bull that said so? Well, no, but our prior general told us that the Pope had issued one. Well, let us see the document, says the canons. There's a showdown in the cathedral. This is actual. We have the documentation for all of this. And even though I'm kind of paraphrasing it and dramatizing it, this is kind of what really was going on. And the canons said, no way in hell. Give us the proof. And then, obviously, if the Pope says we have to, damn it. But we're not going to believe it just because you say so. Now, there were some communication problems, too, in terms of getting a copy of the bull. Why was this? 1327. So in 1328, when the Augustinian delegation arrives in Pavia, who is in Pavia? Louis of Bavaria, with his army, fitted up camp, ready for his march on Rome. Louis knew that the Augustinians were supporting the Pope. So is he going to let anything from the Pope get through? No way. So the Augustinians are like, damn it, okay, what do we do? Now, this was more than just that political strife. It was also an issue of when we think about it. John the 22nd was cutting in half, at least, the canon's income. They're getting completely screwed. It's like, here's the income from the parish that you live on. Now you have to share that half and half with the hermits. Who goes first in civic processions? Does the canons or do the hermits? It's a matter of priority. And which order was the true order of St. Augustine? Who were the true sons of Augustine? And it's in this context that we find the hermits creating a history for themselves. To prove that they and they alone were the true sons and heirs of their father, leader, teacher, and heir, Augustine of Hippo. And the canons came much later, as they say. They were only founded in the late 11th century. They weren't originally from Augustine. Now, this set off a debate that was ongoing throughout the later Middle Ages, and even Luther knew about it. And Luther did take the side of the hermits. We'll get there when we get there about it, but it all started here. It all started because of John the 22nd's bull Veneranda Sanctorum, granting custody to the hermits of Augustine's relics and bones and body in Pavia, cutting out the canons. And that phrase, father, teacher, leader and head is first used in Veneranda Sanctorum. It became then one of the themes of Augustine's, the Hermit's writings from there on out. They had to prove their case. And sometime between 1327 and 1343, a new series of sermons have been discovered that prove the Hermit's case. These sermons became known as Augustine's sermons to his brothers in the Hermitage, or Sermones of Frati Suis in Eremo. One of the earliest collections. We have two, and this is a project I'm still working on, actually, trying to figure out. Get to the bottom of it. But I made a lot of progress, actually. So the latest information on this is what I'm telling you right now. We have two very early collections. One is by a secular priest in Paris, Robert de Bardis, and the other is by Jordan of Quedlinburg, an Augustinian hermit who's teaching in Erfurt, and about whom I'll say a lot more next lecture. Augustine presented the Paris cloister, because he had studied in Paris, and he actually had an administrative role in the order that he had to go back to Paris. In 1343, his autograph, the manuscript that he wrote by hand, of what's called the Collectanea Sancti Augustini, or a collection of Augustinian texts, which included these new sermons to his brothers in the Hermitage. Now, this could be a very complex textual argument. I've argued that we can discern that Jordan was not the originator of these, or the forager of these sermons, but neither was Robert de Bardis. They go back to something place earlier. Now, it gets very complex to put it all together, and what's the relationship between Robert and Jordan, because Robert's collection also has a couple of sermons that Jordan's doesn't, and vice versa. And the collection kept growing and growing and growing and growing. Until the end of the 15th century, you had a collection of 75 sermons. For Jordan, there are 23. And it grows from 23 to 25. Maybe even originally been 18. Now, why do I say this collection? Of this collection, there are two authentic sermons of Augustine that we can authenticate actually were sermons of Augustine. There are a couple of sermons dated from the 6th century that we now know the author was Caesarius of Arles, but had been ascribed to Augustine. And then there are a number of sermons that could only have been written in the 14th century, only could have been written after 1327. It's also at this time where we see a number of new accounts of Augustine's biography. This is called what I've called the myth of Augustine is developing. One of the earliest was an anonymous Augustinian hermit, dated approximately 1330, portraying Augustine as the founder of the hermits, very fiercely. And then in 1332, there's another one called from Alessandro of Alexandria, a sermon on St. Augustine, which even then embellishes the whole argument even further. And then the most extensive one was done in 1334 by Henry of Freemar, with his treatise on the origins and development of the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, and its original title and all of that. It's a fascinating development of the embellishing of this story, this myth, to fit the political needs of the hermits at the time. Did they know they were doing this? Were they doing this? We're going to make forgeries. No, I believe that they believed what they were writing. They fill in the details. They elaborate, but they believe the general story. Now, Henry of Freemar was teaching in Erfurt when Jordan got there in 1322. They became very close. They worked together. Henry was much older than Jordan. And in 1327, just as Veneranda Sanctorum is being issued, Jordan of Quedlinburg is lecturing on the Gospel of Matthew. And that is the origin of his exposition on the Lord's Prayer. And we'll hear more about that when we get there. But it was this attempt to be followers of Augustine, because the thing was, if we are indeed the true sons of Augustine, we better know our Augustine better than anybody else. And that led to then this return to the sources of Augustine, to the academic study of Augustine. And in that context, in the 1340s, then, beginning really with Gregory of Rimini in his commentary on the sentences, lectures on the sentences at Paris, we see a new attack against the Pelagians. Even though Bradwardine had already started at Oxford, it starts with Gregory and one of his successors, Alphonsus Vargas. Even though Alphonsus did not mention the New Pelagians whatsoever, but has a very strong Augustinian position on predestination. And then Hugolin of Orvieto and John of Basel, and on we go. It's a